Welcome everyone to another episode of OutBirding with Field Guides. I'm Brett Whitney.
I'm Dan Lane.
And we're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at Dan's house, where we are going to watch Dan sketch and then paint with watercolor a Rufous-browed Peppershrike.
Yeah, this is part of a project that we're just initiating, which will be a Field Guides calendar. And the theme of the calendar will be the bird names for which members of Field Guides have been named. Maybe familiar if we have bird names. And so we are selecting the first 12. Mike Regner is doing 6 and I'm doing 6. And you'll get to see me doing the last of my paintings today.
Fantastic, and that's the neighbor's dog.
So I've already completed 4 of the paintings, of the 6 paintings that I'm going to be doing for the calendar. And these are they.
Beautiful. Let's see what we've got here. I'll come in a little bit closer. So there is Peggy Watson, the horned puffin. That's me, Mississippi Kite, Brett. Very nice. Jan Pearson is the northern gannet. And now from the other side of the Atlantic, we have Terry Stevenson's Greater Honey Guide. Those are beautiful, Dan. Really nice. Thanks.
The painting that I'm going to be working on while this is filming is the Rufous-browed Peppershrike, which is the bird name for the illustrious John Rowlett. And John has been named Rufous-browed Peppershrike because he's cheerful and chunky, which is a way to describe the behavior and sound of Rufous-browed Peppershrike as well.
And that originated with Edgar Kincaid. That was right. His reasoning, I believe, on first trip to Mexico. That
first degree name, right?
Yeah,
first generation.
First order, yeah.
And so Rufous-browed Peppershrike is kind of a chunky bird that is typically in the canopy of tropical forests. So I've got some still frames from this video here. I've sort of stopped the video, which you can't do in the field, obviously, but it's kind of helpful if you want to do a gesture drawing. I've stopped the video on a couple of frames that I think might be of interest. And so I'm going to just do some rough sketches. So you'll be watching me doing these sketches as I'm observing the frame of the video here. I know a lot of people start with ovals. You have connected ovals and then you start building on that. And that's not something I've ever really done explicitly. I think I might sort of do some of that in my head, and I'm tracing the general outline. I just start in with sort of a rough kind of drawing, but yeah, I correct it as I'm going along with these sketches, and sometimes I'll do 4 or 5 different sketches to try to capture one that I think really brings the bird to life appropriately. I am intending to draw this to be approximately life size for a Rufous-browed Peppershrike, and I've handled enough Rufous-browed Peppershrikes that I have a vague idea of what life size is. So that's one of my goals here. It's funny that in some ways the Rufous-browed Peppershrike has this interesting character that it's cheerful in its song if you listen to it sing. And it does have sort of an ebullience to it, but the facial expression, because of that real dark eyebrow, and especially the South American populations with the orange eye, yeah, to me give it a real angry face. So it's calling it cheerful and chunky sometimes seems a little bit counterintuitive. And I guess in some ways that might make it better to use the Mexican population because the eye is dark in Mexico. It's a dark brown versus an orange. And so it gives it a softer expression that may make it a little bit more cheerful than if I were to use a South American bird.
So this is sketch number 4 now of the Peppershrike.
Yep, I'm just getting one more posture here just to give myself a couple of options. So this is going to be a bit more of a face-on view, which is always kind of I think an engaging view for a piece of art of the bird.
Yeah. You know, it really is remarkable to see this bird coming to life like this in this drawing, Dan. It's really cool.
Well, I guess that's the point. I would say that probably any bird artist, I may be wrong, but imagine that just about any bird artist will tell you the absolute most difficult part of a bird to draw accurately is its feet, especially passerines. Their feet are just such bizarre little structures. I think that most people concentrate on the bird's face though, so as long as you really get the bird's facial expression down, you're likely to pass. Alright, so I think that pretty much does it. And you can see that some of the things that are important to really work on the sketch, you want to make sure the eyes are well placed. I think that really makes all the difference for getting the facial expression correctly. And then of course things like the way the wings sit and making sure you've got the wing coverts and the primaries and secondaries and so on. And then also there are certain feather tracts that are important to sort of make sure you've got sort of roughly gestured out. So that's what I've done here. Basically I've got 4 sketches, which I think I can show you here, give you a little bit of idea of what I have in mind. So those are the 4 sketches for the Peppershrike. So I'm just going to sort of study these for a moment, see which one really resonates most with me, and then trace that and put it on the paper. So that we think we're going to do a image of the bird kind of foraging, peering down into some vegetation. So I've got this final sketch here, and I'm going to do the tracing of it now so that I can put it onto the watercolor paper. So this is tracing paper. It's very fine. You can see through it quite well, and hence the tracing purpose. So just put that over my drawing here and go back over the lines with pretty thick graphite. Make sure I've got lots of graphite on here because I'm going to want to press it down from the other side, which will then put it onto the watercolor paper.
That really is looking good, man.
So that's the end of the sketching process. From here on out, it's going to be the actual painting. So just recently needed to put on reading glasses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of do a rough layout. So the only drawing I'm bringing to the watercolor paper is the outline of the bird. And I'm going to sketch that out first, place it approximately where I want it on the final watercolor paper, sketch that onto the watercolor paper, and then I'm going to build the rest of the scene around it directly on the watercolor paper here. So I've got a photograph that I took in the foothills of Oaxaca a couple of years ago. I'm going to use that as my reference material for the background. And that is how I'm going to try to build the rest of this painting. So start with tracing this onto the watercolor paper here. So basically what I'm doing is just running over the same lines I just traced on this paper from the original sketch, and that action will just push the graphite onto the watercolor paper, so it'll be a kind of a ghosted image of the initial sketch. There you see it. It's actually on the watercolor paper here now.
That's wonderful, and so that is faint enough that that will not show through the paint when it gets on there.
Well, even if it does, that's one of the nice things about this style of painting that I use. It's something that is, you can see this style very clearly in Larry McQueen's work. You can often see the initial sketches on the watercolor paper, even through the paint, and it adds a little bit, I think, to the action and the freshness, and I really like that. I like when you don't add too much detail, it doesn't stilt the painting too much, and so even with a little bit of pencil sketching showing through, it still I think it works quite well, and so that's the kind of thing that I'm intending to do here as well. Sketching in a little bit of the shadows that I intend to put on these leaves, just to give myself a guide for the future. And I'll be doing most of this actually with paint. The bulk of the background is going to be probably a bit of wet on wet, which will just result in very fuzzy patches of color. And then I'll probably put in a couple of additional leaves. But that's the overall layout right there.
Beautiful.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We are where we left off with the layout, the penciled layout for the painting, this Peppershrike on stick painting. And so today I'm going to start putting paint to paper. What I'm going to start with was what's called wet on wet, where I lay down water on the paper and then I put paint on that water so it bleeds out and leaves a really nice diffuse image, so it looks like an out of focus background. Basically, I'm going to start just loading the brush up with water. Maybe even get a little bit of color in it just to prime the background here. And just effectively wash it straight across the paper. And I'll put it even over where I've penciled in branches and so on, because I can still go back over that afterwards and put in detail to make those look like leaves and branches after the fact. So I'm just going to effectively put this water down everywhere except for the bird. Just straight across the paper. But also the fact that I'm not breaking where there's branches and leaves helps keep the background looking uniform behind those items.
And when you go to actually paint those in, I suppose you need to let all of that dry first?
Yeah, absolutely, yep. Yeah, so the wet on wet is really just for the background alone. Everything else I'll be doing with a far less washy look. And it's of course very important to bring the water right up to the edge of the bird, because if there's a significant gap of unwet paper, or I guess you could say dry paper, between the background and the bird, it's going to leave a hard edge of paint, which will make the bird not quite pop the same way. And you have to make sure this water is really loaded on the paper, because it might dry too quickly if you don't, and then the wet on wet won't really work as well. All right, so I think that's pretty much what I want. Now I'm going to just mix in a mix of a couple of different things. I'm going to work with paler colors first, so yellows, and usually when light passes through leaves, the leaves show a bit brighter yellow-green, and so I'm going to put in, you can see I've got a little bit of green already mixed in there, but I'm just going to put in some yellows like this and make it kind of patchy. That will be the first thing to suggest light filtering through leaves, sort of make this look like it's got more of a canopy feel. And notice I'm leaving a couple of patches blank, so that's going to be where the sky is passing through. And just a little bit more there. I'm going to go back in now with a darker color. In this case, I'm going to use Payne's Gray, which is a real nice kind of a slate or bluish gray color that I find makes for a pretty good sort of shaded color. And I'm going to use that to indicate out of focus leaves that are shaded. So just go back in and again, just kind of pat this in.
Well, this is looking quite abstract, but it's really working already. You know, it's really really looking neat.
Now here's where I want to be a little careful. I don't want to probably have the Payne's Gray overlapping with where I'm planning on painting foreground leaves, because that will make it a little bit more difficult if I want to make those leaves paler than the background.
Right.
So there, that's already kind of what I'm looking for here. I might put it a little bit here, perhaps. Plus the water's still pooled pretty well, so I might put some just contrasting with the belly of the bird, like that. All right, so that's the background. That's the first wash, wet on wet of the background. Now, I am always a little impatient, and usually that ends up working against me. So the trick is to be sure that once you've done what you want to do with wet on wet, that you let it dry and you don't touch any more paint to it. Even within the bird, if you just happen to touch any of where there's wet water with the pigment that you're putting on the bird, it's going to run into one another, and you're going to have a big bleed of whatever color you put in the bird going into the background. That won't look so great. So we're just going to let this dry. We're going to have to knead this, probably need about 20 minutes or so, let this dry. And once it's dry enough, then I can go back in and start working on the foreground branches and leaves, which will be the next step here. All right, so it's been about 50 minutes or so since we let the painting sit and dry some. You can see that the paint has dried at a fairly hard edge along the edge of the bird here, which is kind of what we want. We want it to help define the outline of the bird. You can see also how the Payne's gray has been bleeding into the yellow and gives these kind of amorphous sort of fuzzy background kind of elements to it. So
looks
that's
really good.
Basically what I was hoping to get.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start working now on the vegetation that's going to be, basically in the foreground. So I'm going to start off with defining the branches here, and I'm using, again, this image I've got from Cloud Forest of Oaxaca, and so I'm trying to see if I can come up with some kind of approximate color here. I'm going to start with a fairly crimson red and then make it a bit darker as I work on it, but start off just defining the structure of these branches. Suggest a little bit of unevenness of the structure here, a little bit of the joints, the knots, and the joints where the stems come off of the main branch there.
I like that nice drip tip that you put on that leaf there with one quick stroke of the brush.
Yeah,
beautiful.
I might actually need to highlight that there's a vine just behind this leaf. Make sure it's visible in the hole there.
Nice.
Bled just a slight bit into the leaf, so I'm going to have to deal with that in a moment, but I will be able to do that. What you can do is you squeeze the water off the tip of the brush that dries the tip of the brush, and you can use that
To pick it up
kind of,
again.
you can absorb some of the paint back up off the paper, or at least form a hard edge, which then will control how much bleeding goes on there. So that's a little trick I've learned. So what I've been using so far on this paper is transparent watercolor, which is what most people think of when they think of watercolor. Watercolor is a pretty difficult medium, I think, for a lot of people because you're prone to making a lot of mistakes. It's actually a fairly complicated medium, and also the pale, the brightest colors on a painting, if you're using strictly transparent watercolor, are the paper itself. So that's the brightest that the painting can be, is the white of the paper. So you're layering from lightest to darkest when you're painting with transparent watercolor. Now I cheat a little bit, and I think a lot of bird artists do, and I use what's called gouache, which is a opaque watercolor, which, as I think I explained earlier, has white as a base. So you can actually, almost like oils or acrylics, you can then go back over darkened areas and make highlights and correct some errors if you've made some with the gouache. I tend to use gouache for highlights and also to add texture to things like branches sometimes to plumage and to highlights on leaves. Ivory white, let's use that. Ivory white is one of my favorites. A slightly warm white, has a little bit of a cream color to it. And this particular brand of gouache is actually kind of a hybrid with acrylic, which is effectively, when the paint dries, acrylic is actually a plastic. And so it's, once it dries, you can't really do much with it. So you gotta be careful with this, but I'm going to use this in sort of a thin wash over the branches to just give them a little bit of sheen. So, for example, you just use this kind of patchily just to give these branches a little more of a three-dimensional feel.
It looks so natural.
And it just gives it a little bit of this kind of light reflectance.
Yeah, and accentuates the quality of having a bark skin on it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so basically the background is now finished. Now that was, what, 20 minutes in? I'm going to start working on the bird, so I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush now. I'm going to go with a size 6. I have always sort of taken to heart that what you want to do, especially with watercolors, is you want to put in the shadowing before anything else, just to give the bird a uniform shadowing. And so I'm going to start with the underparts. So in order to shade for this, I'm going to make it probably just a little bit ochre. See how this looks. I'm going to have to turn on the electric light. I can't see what I'm doing here.
Let's see what this does to our image here.
Should help. It's nice and bright. It's actually something I can use at night to paint. So I'm just going to lay down a very light wash just to indicate feather tracks, basically. So starting on the throat here, and then onto the side of the breast. So I'm just going to sort of use this to outline some feather tracks, so the light will be hitting the side of the bird pretty much straight on there, but the undertail coverts will be in shadow. And the wing will probably leave a bit of a shadow, so like that. So that's the shading for the underside of the bird. Now I'm going to switch colors. Since the head is a flat gray, I'm going to just go with pretty much gray here. I want to get that separate from what I've already put down. Pretty much starting here on the forehead and around the eye. Looks like it's actually almost whitish right around the eye. And there's the molar. The auriculars. Now the eyebrow is going to be rufous, as the name implies, so you don't want to touch that with gray too much. So the head is pretty much all gray, and that's going to contrast with the green of the upper parts. So now I'm doing the shading for the dorsal surface here, and I find a lot of tropical birds. I'm assuming this must have something to do with the fact that these birds don't really need to fly long distances, and their plumage is often quite shaggy, kind of a hairy texture. So I won't put a lot of work into defining like the scapulars, for example. And in fact, looks like the wing coverts blend right into the scapulars and back. So I'm not going to put a lot of definition into those. And there's the primary coverts there. And
those little strokes that you just did there to define those wing coverts, that takes some practice, man. You just kind of zip, 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 and there they are. Three-dimensionality.
So the body, the upper parts of this thing are going to be a nice, rich olive green. So basically I'm just going to use this, and I'm going to water it down so that it's not too thick. Kind of wash that down so it's not quite as intense a color. But you can see here how the green, the lighter green of the upper parts is now going to just sort of coat what I put down originally as shading there. It sort of bleeds it up so it's not quite as intense.
Boy, that chest is...
And also sort of knocks back the hard edge along the scapular versus the wing. And now I just want to...
Just getting that kind of degree right, Dan, looks like a really kind of subtle, experience-based way to work. Boy, it's fantastic.
All right, let's get the tail here. I'm going to do these in long strokes so they're not choppy. Different populations of peppershrike have different colored eyebrows. Some are real dark, rich brown, almost to a sort of a blackish at some points. And this one has a much less intense rufous. It looks like it sort of bleeds into the rear of the crown a little bit. So basically I just want to...
You just made that color.
Well, no, I'm actually taking, that's a burnt sienna. So that's straight out of the tube.
Oh, okay.
Right there. I didn't mix anything. I want that to be fairly pure. So that there. And I'm going to try a little bit of mixing here. So again, I'm taking the wet brush. I've just cleaned the paint out of it. I'm going to squeeze it so it's got very little water. And then you just draw that into the rear of the crown. That weakens what you've got on the paper right there and sort of helps them blend. And again, it looks like this bird has, I'm not sure if that's a feathered or a skin eye ring that's also rufous. So let's just do that and make this just a little more intense, like that. Meanwhile, the back is drying. I'm going to put a little bit more gray on the head, but I'm going to wait for the brow to dry first. Now I can turn my attention to the underparts, which are going to be a bit of a lemony yellow. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so now I'm going to put down just this flat wash of yellow on the underparts here. It's not quite wet enough. If it gets too dry in the brush, it comes off in a very uneven manner, and that can be quite useless.
And we can still see that subtle shading under that color.
Mm-hmm. So the bill of this particular population has a very silvery colors. I'm going to start with a slightly darker blue-gray color. First of all, I've seen that the background there bled just a little bit into the space I wanted to use for the bill. So I'm going to paint a little bit darker over that just to make sure that the hard edge follows what I want for the bill rather than the background here. That little tip is noticeable, and like that. So again, I'm going to dry the brush, squeeze out the water, and just push the paint around without adding any additional pigment. I'm going to make this cutting edge a little bit less hard. I'm just kind of looking at this to see what I need to deal with next. I'm going to darken the wingtips. Those look like those are truly darker feathers than the rest. And I'm going to put in the edges of the primaries. And then just hint a couple of secondary edges. But the tertials,
This is very Fine tipped brush, huh?
Yeah, it's actually still a pretty large brush. I don't tend to use the small brushes until I'm really doing fine detail. There's tertials. Let's see, put in the primary coverts.
Just like that. There they are.
And there's the greater coverts and the lesser. Just add a little definition to the edge of the scapula, maybe. So there's the wing. And let's see, I can probably deal with the eye, the iris, which is a dark chestnut in this population. It's quite wet, so I'm going to put that in there. It's going to dry and it's going to look a little bit paler than it does now. You actually take it
just like that. The eye is in there. Wow.
It's a little more texture into the feathering here. Meanwhile, like that, and a little bit more.
Once again, you
there.
need to know the anatomy of a bird pretty darn well to get those lines very quickly in the right position. Very impressive.
Right there.
Perfect peppershrike bill. Really, really something.
So the two things I really need to do now is put the eye together. The eye, I think most artists will agree that the eye is the thing that gives the bird life. And so you need to be sure to get the highlight on the eye just right to make it look alive. But first I'm going to put a pupil in it. Putting what's called neutral tint, which is effectively black. I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to highlight, or not highlight, but define, I guess, the outer edge of the eye, and then put the pupil in there, which is often just a little off center because the bird is looking forward, right? So you want that pupil to be slightly forward. Do this, but I've kind of settled on the following to do the highlight in the eye, and I think it works really nicely. Here we go. You want that first dab to be good and solid. And then you want the... There, that's better. So that's the highlight I was looking for right there. It's basically just drawn it, the white gouache around the edge of the eye, giving it its round, glassy texture, which I think just brings that bird to life. So I have just sketched in a katydid, which is the kind of thing that this bird would really like to eat. Well, I'd say that's pretty much it.
That is a wonderful painting, Dan.
So the last touch,
Of course.
is, let's see, where should I put it? About right here. With the old John Hancock. And that is a Rufous-browed Peppershrike for the
It
calendar.
sure is. That's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Isn't that incredible? It didn't exist a couple hours ago, and now we have that wonderful painting. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
All right. Here is that Field Guides calendar showcasing original watercolor paintings by Dan and Micah Regner. Each month's painting features a bird for which one of our older Field Guides personalities was named, and each person's backstory for how their bird name came to be makes for some fun birding trivia. There's John Rowlett, the Rufous-browed Peppershrike. Although we're already a month into 2021, we still have some of these lovely calendars, which will soon become collector's items. So be sure to get one for yourself or as a gift for someone else soon. They're available on our Field Guides store, which you can find via the menu at the upper right corner of the fieldguides.com homepage. Thanks for supporting us. We greatly appreciate it.